Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It's strange how a house can start to feel like a hospital when someone you love begins to fade inside it, how the smell of antiseptic creeps into the air no matter how many candles you light, how the softest blankets can't keep the cold from settling in someone's bones, and how every hallway echo sounds like a clock ticking down to something you're not ready to face. Those last weeks with my mother weren't pretty, weren't poetic, and certainly weren't the kind of thing people write songs about. They were raw, exhausting, and gut-deep brutal in a way that only those who've ever truly cared for a dying parent can understand. There were no dramatic monologues or tearful reconciliations. There were just bedpans, feeding schedules, shaky hands, and the slow erosion of a woman who once taught me how to tie my shoes and stand on my own 2 feet when life knocked me down. I was the one who washed her hair when the nurses didn't come. I was the one who sat beside her bed at 2 in the morning, wiping her forehead while she drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes calling me by my name, sometimes mistaking me for a stranger. But even then, in her most fragile moments, when her mind was playing tricks on her, she still called out for me more than anyone else. Not Daniel. Not the golden boy. Not the beloved son who made guest appearances just long enough to earn praise and keep his image polished. No, it was me. Her daughter. The one who stayed when it was hard and ugly and thankless. Daniel, on the other hand, came in every couple of weeks with a bouquet in one hand and his phone in the other. He'd breeze through the front door like a politician on a campaign stop, kiss her cheek, snap a few photos for the family group chat, and then disappear again before the 4 bag needed changing. He always made sure someone saw him arrive, made sure someone heard him say, "Let me know if you need anything," and made damn sure he didn't stay long enough to actually be needed. And the worst part? Everyone lapped it up like cream. The aunts, the cousins, the neighbors, they all thought he was some kind of saint for simply showing his face. Meanwhile, I hadn't had a full night's sleep in months, and no one thought to say thank you. It wasn't about applause. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because she was my mother. But it still stung, that quiet erasure, that subtle dismissal of everything I gave while he walked away with the spotlight and the sympathy. And then came the funeral, polished, formal, and more for the living than for her. I stood quietly in the corner while Daniel took center stage, giving a carefully rehearsed speech about her warmth, her resilience, her laughter echoing through the halls. He spoke like he'd been there for all of it, like he knew her in those last months the way I did, when her voice shook and her hands curled and her dignity slipped through her fingers piece by piece. He stood tall, dabbing at dry eyes, shaking hands like a public figure, accepting condolences like medals pinned to his chest. And I stood there, swallowing the bitter taste in my throat, wondering how someone could speak so beautifully about a woman he didn't bother to help feed. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I wanted to stand up and tell the truth, but I didn't. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than grief, and I wasn't going to cheapen my pain by trying to prove it. But what cut the deepest wasn't his speech or the applause he got afterward. It was what I heard later, when I stepped into the hallway to get some air and found him speaking to one of our cousins near the coat rack, his voice low and smug in that way he used to sound when he thought he was being clever. "It's all coming to me anyway," he said, barely bothering to keep it quiet. Mom made it clear. She knew I'd take care of everything. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides, not from shock, but from confirmation. He wasn't just posturing, he truly believed he deserved everything, that he'd earned it somehow by simply being born first, by being charming, by being the son. And suddenly, I realized it had never occurred to him that I might stand in the way of his clean, easy inheritance. Ever been erased from your own story by someone who only showed up for the photo ops? Tell me. I know this happens more than we like to admit. I know some of you have had to watch someone else collect credit for work they never did, for sacrifices they never made, for love they never truly gave. So tell me, what did you do with that anger? I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I went home and lit one of the candles I used to burn during the long nights beside my mother's bed. I sat in silence and let my heart settle. And then, A few days later, I received a letter from the law office handling the estate. But it wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a warm request to attend the reading of her will. It was a notice. A notice that I wasn't named as a beneficiary. Not even mentioned. And that was the moment I knew my brother had no idea what kind of story he was actually in. Because mine wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. There's a point where rage turns into something colder, something quieter, something far more dangerous than yelling across a table or throwing plates at the wall. That's where I found myself in the days after receiving that letter, standing not in grief, not in helplessness, but in something sharper and steadier, something that hummed beneath my skin like a low electric current. I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't go storming into the law office demanding answers. Instead, I poured a cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started pulling out every piece of paper, every file folder, every scrap of record I had collected over the last 5 years of caring for my mother. Because while Daniel was busy collecting sympathy and real estate, I had been collecting evidence of love, of labor, of time. Old medical appointment schedules, pharmacy receipts with my name on the pickup slips, power of attorney documents for short-term decisions, signed by her shaking hand during hospital visits. I had notes from doctors, care logs from hospice workers, even a handwritten list from my mother detailing the medications I had to administer every night while Daniel was sending her get-well-soon texts from his second home 2 states away. I didn't think it mattered at the time. I never kept those documents for leverage. I kept them because I was terrified of making a mistake, of forgetting a dosage, of failing her in the one area I could still control while everything else was slipping away. But now I saw them for what they were, a paper trail. A history he could never rewrite no matter how many eulogies he delivered or hands he shook. And the more I laid them out on my table, the more I began to remember all the moments that, at the time, I swallowed down as minor insults, but now saw clearly for what they were, little acts of erasure. Each one adding up like drops in a bucket until the weight of it nearly drowned me. I remembered the time Mom tried to tell Daniel she wanted to change her will, how she brought it up gently over tea, saying something like, "I think I need to talk to Mr. Collier again, just to make sure everything's fair." And I remembered the way Daniel immediately cut her off, leaning in with that patronizing tone that he used so effortlessly when he wanted to sound caring, but really just wanted control. "Don't stress yourself out, Mom," he said, all fake concern and smooth dismissal. "It's fine the way it is. You've already taken care of everything. You need to rest." And just like that, the conversation ended. He always knew how to redirect her, how to flatter and soothe while steering her away from decisions he didn't like. He was the master of the gentle block, the polite manipulation. And I didn't fight him then, because I thought, foolishly, that love would count for something in the end. That even if the paperwork wasn't perfect, the truth would carry weight. But the truth doesn't carry weight unless it's backed by ink and signature. And I was done believing that goodness on its own would be enough. So I made an appointment with Mr. Collier, not to argue, not to scream, not to make a scene. Just to sit across from him in that mahogany-paneled office with the dusty law books and the worn leather chairs and clarify a few things. When he greeted me, he was polite, reserved, the way lawyers always are when they're bracing for emotional storms from grieving family members. He sat down across from me and said, with carefully measured tone, "Laura, I assume you received the notice. I want you to know this wasn't personal. It was simply what the will states." "I understand," I said calmly, folding my hands in my lap. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to clarify something." He looked surprised, maybe even relieved. But his eyebrows lifted just slightly when I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, sliding it slowly across the polished desk toward him. He hesitated before picking it up, glancing at the label. "It's not from the estate," I said before he could ask. "It's from a separate account. Something my mother handled privately without Daniel." He looked at me then, really looked, as if suddenly realizing I wasn't just another overlooked daughter quietly disappearing into the background of someone else's legacy. He opened the envelope, pulled out the contents, and began to read. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't asking to be seen. I was making sure they couldn't ignore me anymore. There's something haunting about the way certain memories return, not with a loud bang, not with any dramatic epiphany, but with a slow, creeping certainty that wraps around your spine and reminds you that not everything important is written in bold headlines. Some truths hide in the quiet corners, tucked away in old drawers and low conversations, remembered only when the silence finally makes space for them to rise. That's what happened to me the day after I slid that envelope across Mr. Collier's desk and watched his expression shift from professional indifference to something much more cautious. I sat in my living room later that evening, staring at the fireplace that hadn't been lit since the day my mother stopped walking on her own, and that's when it came back to me, not a sudden flash, but a slow unfolding of a moment I'd tucked away like so many others. It had been a lazy, quiet afternoon about 4 years ago, back when Mom still had good days, days when her hands weren't trembling, when her voice carried a little strength, when she could sit out on the back porch with a cup of chamomile tea and talk to me about things other than painkillers and blood pressure. I remember the sun slanting through the trees, the wind brushing against her thinning hair, and the way she reached for a manila envelope that had been sitting beside her chair like it was just another piece of mail. She pulled out a few papers, handed me a pen, and said, almost offhandedly, just in case anything happens, this one's yours. I didn't ask too many questions at the time. I just nodded, signed where she pointed, and tucked the envelope away in the cabinet next to the spare batteries and first aid kit. She didn't say it was a secret, but she didn't say it was meant for anyone else either. It wasn't a large policy, not $1 million jackpot, not a lottery ticket disguised in legalese, but it was enough. Enough to matter. Enough to have meaning. Enough to remind me that maybe, just maybe, she saw more than she said. Daniel had no idea it existed. That was the part that made it feel so strangely satisfying, not because I wanted to gloat or because I cared about beating him at his own game, but because it reminded me that my mother hadn't been blind to everything. She may have been tired, confused at times, and too trusting for her own good, but she still had moments of clarity. Moments when she chose me, not him. And she didn't do it with loud declarations or dramatic changes to her will. She did it quietly, like she did most things, with a small gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. While I sat with that memory, Daniel was busy picking out countertops. Yes, literally. He'd already started renovation plans on the house, Mom's house, the one he now referred to as his retirement project. He paraded design samples across social media, showed off blueprints to relatives, talked endlessly about converting the study into a wine cellar, as if grief had a deadline and inheritance came with a welcome mat and a Pinterest board. He'd already spoken to contractors, scheduled walkthroughs, and started making purchases on credit he didn't even own yet. He walked around like a man already crowned, laughing louder, standing taller, his smug confidence infecting every conversation. And I let him. I watched from a distance. I smiled when relatives said things like, "Daniel really stepped up, didn't he?" I nodded politely when someone mentioned how lucky he was to get the house. I even congratulated him once, just to see the surprise flicker across his face. He couldn't figure me out, couldn't understand why I wasn't fighting him, why I wasn't clawing at the will or pleading for recognition. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was too proud to beg, too bitter to act, too weak to respond. But what Daniel forgot was that people like me don't react like storms. We move like tides, quiet, steady, and impossible to stop once the shift begins. And then it happened. While sorting through an old box of medical files I had stashed away in the hallway closet, I found something I hadn't seen in years. It was buried beneath appointment slips and discharge summaries, a folded document in my mother's handwriting marked simply, "Trust Agreement." I opened it carefully, the pages brittle at the edges, and saw her signature right at the top. But it wasn't the original form that caught my attention. It was the small, handwritten amendment attached to the back, signed and witnessed by one of the hospice nurses who had been with us during those final months. It was dated nearly a year before she passed. And it stated, in her own words, that any remaining estate value, in the event of disproportionate allocation, should be subject to review based on the documented caregiving efforts provided by her daughter. Not her children. Her daughter. It wasn't a will. It wasn't filed formally with the courts. But it was real. It was signed. It was witnessed. And it was enough to open a door Daniel never even knew existed. Because in the end, what Daniel forgot wasn't just a piece of paper or a quiet signature tucked into a forgotten file. What he forgot was that Mom didn't need a courtroom to choose me. She already had. There's a strange kind of power that comes from finally realizing you don't need permission to stand your ground, to claim what's rightfully yours, to stop asking for the kind of acknowledgement that should have come naturally from people who should have known better in the first place. I felt that power for the first time in years as I sat across from Lena in her office, a narrow little space tucked between a dentist's clinic and a real estate agency, where the walls were lined with case files and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air like an old friend. I handed her the document, folded, creased, still carrying the faint smell of mothballs and dust from the box I'd pulled it out of, and waited in silence while she read. She didn't say anything for the first few minutes, which was unusual for Lena. Normally, she narrated everything she read out loud, always thinking through cases like she was teaching a class. But this time, her eyes scanned the page with a slow, deliberate intensity that told me she was reading not just with her legal mind, but with her instinct, the way seasoned lawyers do when they know something quietly explosive has just landed in their hands. Finally, she looked up, eyebrows raised just slightly, and said, "Do you know what this is?" I nodded once, calm and steady. "I think I do." "This isn't just a trust amendment," she said, tapping the document with the end of her pen. "It's a care compensation agreement. And that changes everything." I watched as she pulled out a separate folder from her desk drawer, flipping through templates and statutes with the kind of precision only a woman who's fought in courtrooms can manage. She explained that what my mother had written and signed wasn't some symbolic gesture or informal letter of gratitude. It was a legal directive, a document that clearly acknowledged that I had provided caregiving services for an extended period, that those services had monetary value, and that my compensation for those services was to come directly from her estate before it was distributed to any beneficiaries. In plain English, she said, looking at me now with something close to admiration, "This means your brother doesn't get a dime until the estate settles what your mother owed you. And from what I've seen in your records, the number we can put on that care is not small." I exhaled slowly, not from surprise, but from the steady rush of validation that settled in my chest like warm weight. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't demanded compensation while Mom was alive, never tallied my hours or sent invoices like some cold-hearted accountant. But my mother had seen me, even in her quietest moments. She'd known what I gave up. My job, my sleep, my time, my freedom. She'd known what it cost me to stay when everyone else walked away, and she'd chosen to put it into writing. Not because I asked her to. Because she wanted to. Lena leaned back in her chair and smiled, that sharp, satisfied grin she only used when she knew a win was inevitable. "We'll draft a formal claim," she said. "We'll attach all your care records, all your receipts, all your witness statements. And by the time this is on the table, your brother's going to wish he'd thought twice before parading around like a damn Rockefeller." But I wasn't ready to drop it on the table just yet. Not immediately. Letting Daniel walk around with that smug look on his face, grinning at relatives like he'd just pulled off a masterstroke of inheritance politics, that was part of the plan now. The more secure he felt, the harder the fall would hit when the ground beneath him finally gave way. Because this wasn't just about money. It wasn't about revenge either, not entirely. It was about truth, about honoring the reality that everyone else chose to ignore. It was about reminding people that just because you don't make noise doesn't mean you weren't the one doing the work. And for once in my life, I didn't feel the need to justify my role or explain my actions or soften the blow to protect anyone else's feelings. Daniel didn't know any of this yet, of course. As far as he was concerned, the story was already over, wrapped in a bow and stamped with his name. He was preparing to host the will reading himself, like some self-appointed executor of a legacy he barely contributed to. Extended family had been invited. Caterers were arranged. He'd even mentioned he was having it in the old family dining room, like the final chapter of a book he thought he'd written alone. But what Daniel didn't know was that stories don't end just because the main character thinks they're the hero. And he certainly didn't expect me to show up. But I did. And I wasn't coming empty-handed. There's a particular kind of silence that only happens in rooms where everyone assumes the story is already over, where the ending has already been decided and all that's left is the performance, the polite nods, the gentle sighs. The signatures passed from hand to hand like a slow, inevitable ritual. That was the air I walked into when I stepped through the doorway of the old family dining room, the same room where we'd spent holidays carving turkey and pretending things were fine even when they clearly weren't. The same room where my mother once played the piano softly while Daniel and I fought over who got the last slice of pie. Now it was full of carefully dressed relatives sitting in straight-back chairs, sipping coffee from porcelain cups, nodding along while my brother stood at the head of the table like a man preparing to accept a crown he believed he'd earned by birthright. I walked in mid-sentence. Mr. Collier had just started reading the will, his voice low and steady, the way lawyers always speak when they're trying to make grief sound official. Daniel paused only briefly when he saw me enter, and I watched his mouth curl slightly at the corner, a half-smile laced with disdain, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience in what he thought would be his perfect little moment of triumph. "Look who decided to show up," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Always making an entrance. You do love drama, don't you, Laura?" I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. I walked straight to the table, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and pulled out a chair at the far end, across from Mr. Collier, but close enough that when I dropped my folder on the table, the sound echoed just slightly in the space between us. I opened the folder slowly, carefully, like I had all the time in the world, and slid a single document across the polished surface toward Mr. Collier. I didn't need to say anything yet. The weight of the paper said enough. His fingers hesitated for a second before he picked it up. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then the second. His brow furrowed. He adjusted his glasses, reread a few lines, then looked up at me, his mouth suddenly tighter, his voice suddenly drier. "We'll need to pause here," he said, clearing his throat. Daniel laughed, not a real laugh, not a laugh from the gut, but that hollow, nervous kind of sound people make when they think things are slipping and they don't know how to stop it. "Are you serious?" he said, standing now, his voice rising. "What the hell is she pulling now?" "That's nothing. She's just trying to cause problems, like always." Mr. Collier didn't respond to him. He kept reading. "That's not even official," Daniel snapped. "It's a fake. You can get anyone to sign something and backdate it. This is nonsense." I sat back in my chair, calm as ever, watching the chaos unfold across the table like a slow-motion avalanche. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just waited for Mr. Collier to finish reading. And when he did, he set the document down with deliberate care, folded his hands on top of it, and looked Daniel in the eye. "The signatures are real," he said quietly. "The witness listed is a certified medical professional. The dates match the timeline of your mother's care. This agreement is not only legitimate, it's legally binding." Daniel stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "That's impossible," he muttered. "She never mentioned anything like this. I was the one who helped her with everything. She never said a word." "She didn't need to," I said, finally speaking, my voice steady and clear. "She signed it. She knew exactly what she was doing." The room fell completely silent again. No one stirred. No one breathed too loudly. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, not in pity or judgment, but in disbelief. They were starting to realize that the story they thought they understood was only half written, and the other half had been quietly unfolding all along, far away from the spotlight Daniel loved so much. Mr. Collier leaned back slightly and opened his briefcase, pulling out a notepad. "Before we proceed with any further reading," he said, his voice all business now, we'll need to address this agreement. The estate cannot be distributed until this claim is settled in full. That includes calculating compensation and adjusting the beneficiary structure accordingly. Daniel sat down hard in his chair, his hands clenched around the edge of the table, his face drained of color. He wasn't smiling anymore. And I hadn't even raised my voice. Because sometimes, all it takes is one document and one look to remind people exactly who they've underestimated. And I hadn't even gotten started yet. There's a certain kind of silence that follows a storm, not the kind that brings peace or relief, but the kind that lingers like dust in the air, heavy and unsettling, reminding everyone that something cracked and nothing will ever be quite the same again. That was the silence I walked away with after that meeting, after the document was read, after the last of the family left the table with awkward glances and hushed whispers. I was darting between me and Daniel like we were strangers who'd collided in the middle of a war no one had seen coming. And maybe, in a way, we were. Because whatever remained of the sibling bond we once shared had dissolved quietly over time, eroded by years of entitlement on his part and swallowed resentment on mine, until there was nothing left but two grown adults staring across a table with nothing to say and too much history between us to say it. Daniel didn't yell after the meeting. He didn't come after me with threats or insults or one of his usual passive-aggressive rants. No, he just sat there, pale and humiliated, trying to piece together how the narrative he'd written so confidently had unraveled in front of an audience he thought would always be on his side. He didn't want a court battle. He didn't want press. He didn't want the family chatter turning into gossip about how the golden boy had been legally outmaneuvered by the sister he always dismissed. So, of course, he chose the quiet settlement route, the discreet option, the one that allowed him to keep some shred of dignity intact while writing a check that probably tasted like poison in his mouth. I took what was owed to me. Not a penny more, not a cent less. Lena made sure every hour I logged caring for our mother was accounted for, every prescription picked up, every overnight vigil, every physical therapy session, every sleepless night spent repositioning her in bed so she wouldn't get sores. I didn't inflate the numbers. I didn't pad the totals. I didn't ask for the house, the jewelry, the antiques Daniel had already mentally arranged in his remodeled living room. I didn't even ask for the piano, though part of me ached when I thought about how its keys would now sit untouched in a room filled with things he never earned. I let him keep it all. Not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't want anything that came with his fingerprints on it. I didn't want walls built on favoritism. I didn't want furniture bought with illusion. I didn't want to live inside a legacy that had been twisted into something bitter and performative. I took the money, signed the paperwork, and left with my dignity intact and my soul a little heavier, but at least mine. And yet, in the quiet days that followed, after the dust settled and the noise faded, a question started circling the edges of my mind like smoke from a candle that had been snuffed out too suddenly. Did I take too much? Not in dollars or cents, not in legal terms or moral ones, but in something harder to measure. Did I go too far? Did I cross a line that should have stayed blurred? Was I seeking justice or just making him feel what I had felt all those years, overlooked, dismissed, unimportant? I still don't know the answer. I didn't want his money. I just wanted him to know he didn't get everything. That no matter how much he believed the story began and ended with his version of events, there were other pages he never read, moments he never earned, sacrifices he never saw. Maybe that's the part that still stings not for me, but for him. That he'll never know what it truly costs to stand in that house day after day, feeding pills and wiping tears and pretending like it didn't break me to see our mother fade one breath at a time. But I know, and I'll always know. And maybe that's enough. A week after everything was finalized, after the final check cleared and the phone call stopped, I opened my mailbox and found a plain white envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from a small independent publishing group working on a collection of essays about unrecognized caregivers, women and men who had carried the burden of family care in silence, without praise or pay or even acknowledgement. Someone had submitted my name, probably Lena, though she'll never admit it. They wanted me to contribute my story, anonymously or not, my choice. I stared at the letter for a long time, the paper soft in my hands, the weight of it somehow heavier than I expected. I smiled faintly, not because it made me feel triumphant, but because for the first time in a long time, someone wanted to hear my version of things. Not Daniel's version. Not the family narrative. Mine. I picked up a pen, clicked it once, then held it over the form. And for a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted what I'd been through or because I didn't have anything to say, but because part of me still didn't know if telling the story made it more real or just gave it a sharper edge to cut with. Was this closure? Or just a new chapter of something I hadn't finished writing in my head? I still haven't signed the form. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. But at least now, it's finally my decision. And I don't need permission.